What is going on, chess YouTube? So in today's video, I want to show you one of Magnus Carlsen's latest and craziest online blitz games. This one is Magnus versus the Grandmaster Niko Theodorou, I hope I said his name right, from the chess.com servers on January 4th, 2025. Alright, in the game, Magnus opens 1e4 and Niko goes 1e6, the French defense, a very rare guest at the highest level these days, but this was a blitz game, so hey, why not? Alright, we have d4, d5, then knight to c3, the main line from White's perspective. Now, of course, Black has three main options: bishop b4, the Winaver, d takes e4, I believe the Rubinstein variation, and knight f6, the Steinitz or classical variation. Now here, Black does go bishop b4, the Winaver, putting immediate pressure on that knight on c3, and by extension, the pawn on e4, as now d takes e4 is a real threat as the knight on c3 is pinned to the king. Therefore, White does go e5, blocking the center and defending the pawn, and of course, getting the very classical French defense pawn structure in the center. Now, of course, Black follows the main line, c5, putting pressure on that pawn on d4. White goes a3, trapping the bishop seemingly, and Black does trade. So, bishop takes, then b takes, and now we have that classical Winaver pawn structure in the center, with White's pawns on c3, d4, and e5, and Black's pawns on c5, d5, and e6. Alright, now here, the main lines for Black, as far as I can tell, are knight to e7 and queen to c7. One of those moves is essentially necessary, as White has a lot of threats based on the idea of queen to g4, and you do have to get ready for that move. Now, here, instead of either of these main moves, here Black does go knight to c6, and this move is thought to be a little bit dubious. It doesn't do a whole lot against the threat of queen to g4 from White, putting pressure on that very naked, undefended pawn on g7. Now, here, Magnus, he has two main options, or there are a lot of options. The two main lines, the two most aggressive ones are queen to g4, the classical move, again, putting pressure on the pawn on g7, and the more modern idea, I mean, this move has been around for a while, but it wasn't until Alpha 0 that we really saw the full potential of this move, and that is the move h4, and sure enough, that is what Magnus does in the game. So, h4 on the board, and nowadays, this move h4 is thought to be just as dangerous as queen to g4 in all of these Winaver lines, regardless of whether Black goes knight c6, queen c7, or knight e7 on move number 6, i.e. the prior move. Now, what is the idea behind h4 here? Well, it's very simple. White is going to go h5, maybe even threaten h6 before going queen to g4, and this h-pawn is going to make White attack later in the game very, very dangerous. And White may even be playing on both sides of the board, for example, h4, h5, maybe queen g4, but you also might go, say, a4, rook b1, bishop b5, and so on. It's a very subtle, nuanced strategy from White's perspective. All right, now here, Black. How does he continue? Well, he's got several different moves. Knight g to e7, queen c7, and queen a5 are all playable, but in the game, bishop d7 played for Black, a very flexible move. Now, the bishop is not doing a whole lot on d7 yet, but there are two purposes of this move. First of all, you are setting up long castles to the queen side. You are one step closer to castling. All you have to do now is move the queen somewhere, say e7, b6, or a5, and beyond that, if White goes bishop b5 later in the game, and bishop b5 is a very common move when you go for this h4, h5 strategy, then the bishop will be very well placed on d7, supporting that knight on c6. All right, now here, White goes h5, again continuing that Alpha 0 plan, and now where is the queen going to go? In the game, queen to a5 played by Black, a very active square for the queen. The other good one being c7, but on a5, it does have the benefit of immediately threatening queen takes c3, forking both the rook on the a1 square and the king on the e1 square. All right, now here, Magnus, how will he defend? He goes bishop d2, a very typical move in this line, just supporting that pawn with the bishop, and now sure enough, Black does castle. Long castle on the board for Niko Theodorou. Again, I hope I said his name right. And Black here has a slightly worse, but overall very solid setup, and it's going to be a long, strategic maneuvering game from here. All right, now, what is the White idea from White's perspective? Well, turns out it is simply a4, followed by bishop b5, and that bishop would be defended by that pawn on the a4 square. This is the right way to continue from White's perspective, and from there, you wouldn't be threatening, actually, bishop takes c6, and an ongoing attack against the Black king. Now, instead of that, there are other moves. For example, rook b1, sacrificing the pawn on a3 is also decent, but instead, knight f3 played in the game by the GOAT Magnus Carlsen. All right, now here, Niko, how should he continue? Well, the strongest move here is the very typical French defense move f6, biting at that strong pawn center on e5. Instead, queen to c7 played in the game, and queen c7 here is actually a little bit dubious. I mean, I guess the idea is you are getting out of the way of a future c4 break. If, for example, black doesn't go queen c7, say, I don't know, h6 or something, then c4 could be dangerous, as white would have the discovered attack on the queen on a5 via the bishop on d2. So queen c7 does get out of that attack preemptively, but here's the problem. If black wanted the queen on c7, he could have gone queen c7 in one go. Now, instead, after queen a5, bishop d2, then queen c7, black is effectively losing a tempo. White gets bishop d2 in for free, and in all honesty, d2 is not a bad square for the bishop here. It does open up ideas like, say, queen b1 later in the game, for example, or queen to c1. Either of those moves could be quite useful, so black here is just down a tempo after this very dubious move, queen c7. All right, now here Magnus, he continues, rook b1, lining up the rook on the open b file, or the semi-open b file. b1 is typically the right placement for the rook, and very importantly, with the queen no longer on a5, the queen no longer targets a3, so Magnus here just taunting his inferior opponent, saying, joke's on you, taking your queen off the a file, now I go rook b1 with impunity. All right, now here, Niko, how should he proceed? Well, turns out there are a million different options. There really is no rush here as black. For example, c4, blocking the queen side is playable. You can go h6, guarding that h6 square and blocking the white pawn on h5. And beyond that, even moves like king b8 are also playable. In the game, he does go c4, locking down the queen side. And this is a very double-edged decision. Now we have that triple pawn chain in the center for both sides. The center is just in complete lockdown, and all the action for at least the foreseeable future will be happening on the wings unless someone tries to, sacrifice a pawn in the center. I'll have to wait and see. All right, now Magnus here. He plays the move g3. Now, this move kind of confused me. It's not a super typical move you want to play as white in this structure, but I guess the idea, maybe he wants to go bishop g2 at some point, or maybe bishop e2, then king f1, then king g2, as the rook is often better placed on h1 than anywhere else in these lines, especially with the early h4, then h5. All right, now here, Niko, he continues. f5, gaining space on the king side. Now, this is a slight weakening move. White is going to have a lot of chances to punish it. Instead, just continuing, say, h6, then knight g to e7 would have been a little bit preferable, but instead, f5 played in the game. All right, now, Magnus, how does he continue? He jumps in, knight to g5, trying to take advantage of these weakened squares on the king side. Now, obviously, the threat is knight to f7, hitting both the rook on h8 and the rook on d8. Black is going to have to defend. Now, there are several ways to defend. For example, rook d to f8, knight h6, and so on. Both those moves do support f7 and stop the knight f7 idea. But beyond that, of course, Magnus knows black is going to defend. Beyond that, white may be intending knight h3, then knight to f4. So overall, a very long but important rerouting process for the knight. And on f4, that knight will pressure e6 and the light squares in black's camp. So that was likely the idea. All right, now here, black. Knight h6, a very natural move. h6, not a bad square for the knight at all. And very importantly, with that knight on h6, white cannot take it right now, as white's own knight on g5 blocks the bishop on d2. So a very opportune time to go knight h6 in this position. All right, now here, Magnus. He does not go knight h3 yet. Instead, bishop g2 played in the game, a perfectly fine move. Now black does go rook d to f8, setting up the idea of knight f7 himself, and that would not be a bad square at all for that black knight. All right, now, knight h3 from Magnus, again, continuing that plan of knight h3, then knight f4, that being the ideal placement for the knight. And now, sure enough, knight f7 for black played in the game. All right, now here, turns out white should not rush into knight f4. The computer finds other ideas that may be a little bit stronger, including a4 and queen to c1, trying to get the queenside play going a little bit faster. Instead, knight f4 played in the game, and this does give black some chances. For example, here, knight c to d8 is very, very strong, potentially opening up this diagonal for the bishop, and black could gain control of that a4 square, stopping the a4 advance from white, and that is very important, as black may even, white may even want to sacrifice that a pawn on a3 in the future going a4, as opening up the a file is often worth more than the one pawn investment. Now, instead of knight c d8, knight to e7 played in the game, but it turns out e7 is quite a bit weaker of a square for the knight than d8 in this structure. Now, here, the key idea for white, believe it or not, is actually the pawn sacrifice h6 here. The point being, whether you take with the pawn or the knight on h6, white gets a wonderful game. And if you try to block it, let's say h6 then g5, white gains access to the h5 square. So overall, h6 would be a very dangerous idea. Instead, a4 played in the game by Magnus the GOAT. Now, a4 is a pawn sacrifice. Black has the option of just going bishop takes a4, but as discussed, that pawn is often sacrificed in these, early h4, h5 lines in the Winaver. The point being, again, the open a file is worth the one pawn investment. Now here, black, he does not take that pawn. Instead, Niko finds a much stronger idea. That is the move g5, gaining space on the king side immediately. Now, whether white retreats the knight or takes en passant, of course, en passant being whenever black moves a pawn 2 squares forward, or white for that matter, the opponent can capture on the diagonal if they have a pawn right next to it, but only on the first move immediately after that 2-pawn advance. So again, that is en passant for you if you're a beginner. Now here, en passant is possible, knight h3 is also possible, but either way, black's going to be doing just fine. Here, white does take en passant, h6, g6, then h takes, and now we have the rook trade. Rook takes, then rook takes. And now here, white has many different interesting ideas. For example, a5 threatening a6 is possible. Beyond that, queen to c1, intending potentially queen to a3, also possible. I quite like that idea. For example, the main line there goes queen c1, g5, and then you could ignore the threat on the knight and just go queen to a3, threatening the knight on e7, but giving up the one on f4. Instead here, knight to h3 played in the game by Magnus. And now we do have bishop takes a4, finally winning that pawn on the a4 square. Now the a file is officially opened up. Black is up material, but white has the extra open a file to attack the black king. All right, queen to c1, intending queen to a3 potentially is the GOAT. And now here, black, he's got to get his bishop back. The bishop, it did its dirty work, and now simply bishop d7 is the right idea. But instead, here Niko plays a kind of an insane looking move. He plays the move b5, literally trapping his bishop on a4 there for potentially the rest of the game. It may be a very, very long time until that bishop does get back to life. All right, Magnus, queen to a3, putting pressure on that bishop and guarding squares like b4, and also pressuring that knight on e7. So overall, a3, a very good square for the queen. Now, black continues, a5, potentially setting up the idea of b4 later in the game. And before he does that, he will have to go, say, queen c6 or queen d7. But that is the main idea behind a5, threatening b4 at some point, trying to get that mobile queenside pawn majority rolling down the board. And black's king, it may even go, I don't know, to d7 and then over to the king side later. We'll have to wait and see how that all plays out. All right, now, knight f4 for Magnus, pressuring e6, threatening knight takes e6. Black is going to have to respond, and in the game, sure enough, king d7, the king is now a defensive piece in this game, and very importantly, the king is actually somewhat safe there. The rook can swing over, and here, according to the engine, Niko is doing significantly better than Magnus. I mean, Magnus's one pawn sacrifice is not paying dividends yet. All right, now here, it turns out, according to the engine, knight h3 intending knight g5 is the right way forward, but instead Magnus king to e2, getting his own king off the back rank, the ball cloud style move, but not the most precise. And here Niko does gain more space on the other side of the board. g5 drives back that knight. Where's the knight going to go? It goes to h3, but then g4 for black, gaining even more space on the king side, but missing the potentially slightly stronger move. That is the move f4. But instead, g4 played in the game, then knight comes back to f4, and then we do have queen to c6, the obvious idea behind this move being defending that bishop on a4 in advance, therefore threatening that b4 advance, potentially opening up the queen side where black obviously has that very large space advantage. All right, now here, Magnus, rook c1, defending c1 with the rook, a decent defensive idea, but overall a little bit slow. Now here, Niko, rook h7. What is the idea here? Honestly, I'm not sure why rook h7 was played. Perhaps it was a pass in time trouble here, trying to put the pressure back on Magnus. Now, bishop e3. Both sides start to make some sort of waiting moves. Knight g5, king d2, and now rook to h2, finally flying in with the rook. Niko, again, I think he's trying to press Magnus in time trouble, trying to force out a mistake. Now, rook h1, offering the rook trade. Niko goes for it. Rook takes, then bishop takes, then knight to f7, jumping back with the knight. Then we have knight to h5, jumping in, threatening knight to f6. And here, Magnus is starting to fight back. He is starting to get legitimate chances in this game once again. Now, Niko, he steps out of the attack preemptively. King d8, stepping out of that knight f6 attack, but also maintaining the defense of the king on e7. That is very important. You don't want to lose that knight for no reason. That would be game over on the spot. But here, the GOAT, he jumps in. Knight to f6, a very active square for the knight. But here, Niko, he has one really terrific chance to get counterplay going on the queen side, and that is the move b4. The point being, if you take on b4, c takes b4, then black does not take back with the a pawn. No, he goes c3, the double pawn sacrifice. The point being, if queen takes, then you recapture with the a pawn. All the lines open up on the queen side, and black would get tremendous play on that side of the board. Now, instead of b4, that is the key idea. Instead, queen to b6 played in the game. Again, intending potentially b4, but that would give up the defense of the bishop, so b4 isn't even a threat yet. Now, here in this position, Magnus has just a diabolical tactical shot. I don't even know how else to describe it. I am speechless by this move. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the diabolical tactical shot by Magnus right here. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos of Magnus just like this. All right, here, the key idea, and I do want to show this one line. It didn't happen in the game, but I have to show it. It's that good. Bishop takes d5, the temporary bishop sacrifice. Here's the main line. If black takes, e takes d5, you give up the queen. Queen takes e7. The point being, after king takes, knight takes d5, hitting the king and the queen, you regain the material, and you are simply up massively in the ensuing endgame. Now, instead, none of that happened. Instead of here, bishop takes d5. Instead, in the game, f3 played. Magnus trying to open up lines on the king side. He missed the tactical shot in time pressure. It's understandable, but wow, would that have been a killer move by the GOAT. All right, now here, Niko, queen to c7, sliding back with the queen, putting pressure potentially on e5 in some scenario. Now we have f takes, and then knight takes g4. Magnus wings back one of those pawns that he lost earlier in the game, that of course being the pawn on a4 that is no longer with us. And now Magnus does have that passed g-pawn. That will be a very powerful asset if the queens come flying off the board at any moment. All right, now knight g6 develops the knight again. Bishop f3, a decent idea by Magnus, potentially setting up ideas like perhaps queen c1, queen to h1, queen to h7, h6, and so on. Decent idea. Now we have queen to a7, queen to e7, offering the queen trade. And now it turns out Magnus actually has the option of going into the endgame with simply queen takes e7. And again, with that passed pawn on g3, Magnus would have pretty good chances. Now, instead of that, sure enough, he finds a way to keep queens on the board and keep the attack going, much to our benefit. Queen to a1 played by Magnus. The point being the queen's going to slide over to h7, and then, or h1, sorry, and then again, h6 or h7. We'll have to wait and see. All right, knight g5 played by Niko. Trying to counterplay, pressuring that bishop, threatening knight takes f3. Now bishop g2 defends and dominates that knight. The knight has nowhere to go. The bishop covers every single one of those squares. All right, now here, Niko turns out, according to the engine, knight to h7 is the right way forward. Don't ask me why, but that is the engine line. Instead here, knight to e4 played in the game, jumping in with the knight. Very active, very aggressive, very sexy, but I don't know about this move. Here, Magnus, he takes, bishop takes e4, then d takes, and then knight to f6, jumping in with the knight. Now the threat could be, again, queen h1 and then h6, setting up threats. All right, queen f7 played in the game. Queen to a3, threatening queen d6. Magnus sliding back with his queen again. All right, queen e7, offering the queen trade. Queen to a1, declining the queen trade yet again. And now here, Niko, he does go back to f7, offering the draw by repetition. If Magnus wants it, he'll go queen a3, queen e7, queen a1, queen f7, and so on. Now, instead of that, queen b7, it turns out, was the right way forward. Right here, queen b7, threatening ideas later like b4, was the right way. Instead, queen to f7 played, and here Magnus does not go for that draw with queen to a3. Instead, queen to h1 finally played by the GOAT. And now, again, the queen is threatening an infiltration on the h-file here. All right, here, for sure, queen to b7 is the right way forward, again threatening b4, but instead, knight to e7 played by Niko, and this is a massive mistake. It gives up control of that h8 square, and here Magnus comes flying in. Queen to h8 hits the king, king to c7, queen to a8. The queen flying literally all over the board, all the way to the a8 square. Now we have knight c6, trying to defend the best he can is Niko, but now d5. The pawn break in the center. The center is blowing open, and we're seeing the big problem of knight to e4 played earlier in the game. After knight e4, bishop takes, d takes, then the d5 advance becomes possible later in the game, and Magnus is making full use of this opportunity. All right, e takes d5 is the move. Then we have bishop to c5. This is the point of that pawn sacrifice. Lines are opening up. The knight, the bishop, and the queen are all closing in on the king. And look at the poor light squared bishop on a4, the poor French defense bishop. It would have been better if it just stayed on d7 seemingly. All right, now here, one final mistake by black. His only chance here to even have any sort of practical counterplay is the move e3, trying to fight back. Instead, queen to g6 played in the game by Niko. And here Magnus has effectively a mate in 2. Pause the video if you want to try to solve this mate in 2. Even a beginner can solve this one right here. Of course, it is bishop d6 hits the king. King to b6 is the only move, as literally every other square is covered by the queen or the knight. So in the game, king to b6, not b7. King b6 played, and here the final move of the game, knight to d7. Of course, the queen and the bishop control all the other squares, and the knight delivers the checkmate. Wow, what a game between Magnus Carlsen and Niko Theodorou. Again, don't hate me, Niko, for mispronouncing if I did. From this chess.com blitz game on January 4th, 2025. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here, where I covered one of the craziest games from the finals of the 2024 World Blitz Championships between Magnus and Jan Nepomniachtchi. That game was just wild and a wild finish to it. So check that game out, and I'll see you in the next video.